Good afternoon everybody, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another little video. I hope you're all well. So join me today on the 1st of October, which in the art world can only mean one thing. It's the beginning of Inktober. Now I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit anxious about doing Inktober this year. I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to be able to do the whole of Inktober, but I'm definitely going to give it a go. I am however going to start how I mean to go on, and I'm going to try and get today's prompt word done. So I'm planning to fill a couple of spreads in my sketchbook with some doodles and some illustrations in response to today's prompt word, which is gargoyle. Now I'm not gonna lie, gargoyle is not a kind of word that really suits the type of things that I like to draw. Let me get out some art materials. Let's get on with today's video, shall we? So I don't know if you could tell by the tone of my voice, but I wasn't too sure about doing this prompt word. Instantly I kind of had flashbacks to a school art project that I'd done back in high school. I wasn't too enthusiastic about it. But I decided to just basically start by sketching out a few gargoyles in different positions just to see if I could spark off some kind of an idea for an illustration. So I grabbed just a basic HB pencil and I started sketching a couple of gargoyles facing like sideways to get an idea of different profile views, and then I sketched a few more facing forwards and then over a little bit, just trying to get an idea of what made them gargoyle-y and grotesque rather than just normal looking sculptures or statues. So after sketching out a few gargoyles, I started noticing a few common features and elements, so I made a quick little note of these in the corner of my sketchbook, just in case it inspired something in the illustration that I was planning to do a bit later on. So then I carried on working into my pencil sketches a little bit more, so I basically decided to add a few more details, like particularly focusing on the facial features of the gargoyles and adding a few details to the wings. I was basically trying to bring out like the spooky, slightly menacing characteristics and qualities of the gargoyles, because I felt like that would help me create a story behind the illustration, which would then make it easier to come up with like a final idea, as not gonna lie, I was really struggling at this point. So, quick little update, I've just been sitting here sketching out these little gargoyle studies based on some reference photos that I found online. Now, I'm not going to lie, I'm still not really feeling this prompt at the moment because I really don't like drawing gargoyles. I'm determined to not give up on this prompt. I've started noticing that a lot of the gargoyles have got like different animal features and stuff like that. There's like birds' wings and references to like bat wings and animal horns and animal faces and stuff like that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my page over and sit and study some birds that I associate with gargoyles. So probably like, I don't know, in my head I'm thinking like crows and ravens and rooks, maybe pigeons and stuff like that. So I'm going to have a bit of fun drawing some of the things that I usually like drawing, and then somehow in my head I then want to try and do an illustration where the animals are kind of interacting with the gargoyles. So yeah, let me turn over this little sketchbook page and let's sit and draw some things that I actually like drawing. So once again I grabbed my HB sketching pencil and started by sketching a few little rooks or ravens, or they may even be crows, I actually don't know. But yeah, I started sketching out a few birds in different positions on my sketchbook spread. I was particularly trying to focus on drawing them in different positions where I thought they looked like they could be communicating with something or looking at someone, just kind of bear in mind what my ultimate aim and idea for my final piece was. So I studied a few looking downwards at something, as well as a few looking more like upright. I also really love the bird that looks like he's shouting, because I think he looks really animated and full of character, and I just love him. So although I didn't really come across a bird in a position that I wanted to use in my final illustration, I did at this point have a spread full of birds that I could use to explore mark making techniques and materials. So that is what I moved on to doing next. So I started to add a bit of colour into the spread, because anybody who knows me knows I love a little bit of colour, and this sketchbook spread was looking a little bit too plain for me. So I began by using my usual art materials of choice, which is my trusty acrylic paints, and I started to work into the first bird that I'd sketched out. You may notice that I had little blobs of red and yellow and blue on my palette, as well as black and white, and I was actually quite pleasantly surprised at how many different colours I ended up using when painting this little bird study. I think there was even like specks of green and purple thrown in as well. I then moved on to using my watercolour paints, which is a medium that I don't use quite as much as my acrylic paints, but it's something that I've been using a bit more recently, especially in my more storybook style illustrations. So basically I started layering different colours on top of each other just to build up the colours that I wanted, and also tried to put in a few brighter colours just to make the study pop a little bit. I then got out my inks and my dip pens and started working into the bird study using different mark making techniques such as like stippling, cross hatching and just general scribbles. Again focusing on layering details and textures and working into the shading of the study. Oh, and if you're wondering what the little worm model is, he is a little inking friend called Wormetta, who my nephew's named, and basically I just get him out when I need to have somewhere to like rest my dip pens or my paintbrushes when I'm not using them. Oh yeah, I just remembered I did also work into the study with some white acrylic ink as well, just to lighten some of the areas. For the third bird, let's call him Stew. So for Stew, I decided to get out my black fine line pens and my giant chunky Posca pen, and I decided to practice a bit more of my mark making skills. I felt like this was a little bit of a challenge, as on this little rook or raven or crow or whatever Stew is, the feathers were predominantly quite black and there was very little contrast between light and shaded areas, but it was there when I looked hard enough, and I think I managed to capture it fairly well, mainly by concentrating on leaving gaps of white showing through the marks in the light areas and really blocking out the dark parts. On the next bird, Gary, let's call him, I once again got out my watercolour paints, as I felt like the watercolour paints were calling to me on this particular day. I did this time decide to use a mixture of my fine line pens and my dip pens to add detail, and I also decided to use my blue acrylic ink to add subtle marks and textures to the feather. On Keith, the shouty bird, yes, apparently all my bird studies have names now. So on Keith, I used some charcoal pencils to focus on practicing light and shade, and because the reference photo I was using didn't really have a lot of detail in it. Originally I thought I had 3 tones of charcoal, so I thought I had light, medium and dark, but I discovered halfway through that I had 2 mediums and a dark, whoopsie, although that didn't really cause me too much hassle, as I basically just pressed really lightly with the medium charcoal to capture the light areas. So once I'd finished working on Keith, I then went back into working on Bob with my Derwent Inktense water soluble pencils and some white acrylic paint just to add a few more pops of colour and to lighten up a few areas. Okay, just a quick little update. I've just been working on these little studies of some, they're either rooks or ravens, I actually can't tell the difference. I'm actually really pleased with how they've turned out. I really do love the way that these two look. They've got like a real storybook feel to them, which I really like, and I think that's probably how I'm going to end up doing my final piece, using inks and watercolour paints. Although this one here does have, I've decided to call him Mr. Blobnose, because I did have a little bit of a irritant happen with one of my dip pens where it just kind of blobbed a load of ink on it. So next I went on to thumbnail my final idea. So I started by roughly sketching out a gargoyle in the middle of a circle, and then gradually positioned the ravens and a few stars and a moon to fill out the composition a little bit more. Once I'd finished sketching out the thumbnails in pencil, I decided to quickly go over the top of the lines using a charcoal pencil. I could have probably used a pen for this, but I basically just grabbed the nearest implement to me, and I basically just quickly went over the top of the lines with my charcoal pencil just to make a few more decisions about the composition and the layout, and then it was finally time to start working on my final piece. So I then went on to sketching out my final piece. Now I'm not going to lie, I actually ended up doing this over a couple of days, mainly because by this point I'd had enough of gargoyles and it had been a little bit of a battle to get to this point, but also because sometimes I think that coming away from an illustration for a bit and having a break from working on one sometimes allows you to see it in a slightly different light. So yeah, after coming back to the illustration the next morning, I actually started to like the composition a little bit more, and I was looking forward to kind of adding some colour and some shading and some texture to it. So I carried on sketching out the final piece in my sketchbook. Looking back at it now, I sort of wish I'd actually sketched out my final piece on like a separate piece of paper, maybe some watercolour paper, and possibly maybe spent a bit more time kind of refining the sketch and the composition, but hey ho, that's the way it goes. Once I'd finished sketching out the final piece, I began working into it using the art materials and techniques and processes that I'd used earlier on in this video. So I began by using some watercolour paints to block out the colours that I wanted. So for the sky I used like a wet on wet watercolour technique and let the colours kind of bleed in into each other to create a beautiful, bright, colourful sky background. And then I went into working into the birds and into the gargoyle, layering down some colours. Now I'm not going to lie, at this point I sort of regretted not spending a bit more time planning out the colour scheme a bit more, and at the time I did lose a little bit of confidence in the illustration, but after a while I think I just about managed to make the colours work and to pull the illustration back from the brink of despair. Bit dramatic, Meg. So following on from that, I went on to using my ink and my dip pens to add texture and shading using different mark making techniques that I'd practiced earlier on. I think I was maybe a little bit too heavy handed with this part, and the illustration did start becoming a bit too dark and began looking a little bit overworked. I do sort of wish I'd maybe mixed an ink colour so that it was a bit more subtle, as I think using like straight black ink did make me lose a bit of contrast and definition between the gargoyle and the birds. However, I do think I managed to rescue the illustration a bit later on into the process when I started using my dough and Inktense water soluble pencils to kind of balance out the colours and the shading. And then I added some final finishing touches to the piece by using some white acrylic paint to highlight some of the areas and to repaint in the stars. But yeah, here is my final piece. Looking at it now, I actually do quite like the result of this final piece. Maybe I was being a little bit negative about it before. I did decide to go down a bit more of like a goofy or mischievous looking gargoyle route rather than a more sinister or scary character, just because it pleased me a bit more. And yes, the gargoyle does have a name. He's called Gilbert the Gargoyle, and his raven friends are Stevie and Rocket. I'm not 100% sure if Stevie and Rocket are being naughty or nice, but in my little storybook world I think they're maybe being a bit mischievous, and perhaps they're trying to persuade Gilbert to do something a bit naughty. So yeah, thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe to my channel for more Inktober art videos, and I will see you again soon with another arty crafty video. Bye!